Welcome back to my course, World History. Today our topic is the French Revolution. Let me remind to you briefly what we did last time to review and to establish a connection between what we did last time and what we are going to do today. Last time we explored the American Revolution. We stressed that the American Revolution was the child of Enlightenment, driven by Enlightenment ideas of reason, natural laws, improvements, science. We also realized that the American Revolution was the revolution, so-called Atlantic Revolution. There were three Atlantic revolutions, as we remember. The first one was the Glorious Revolution in England, 1688. Second one, the American Revolution, 1776. And today, the third Atlantic Revolution is the French Revolution, 1789. What was common among these three revolutions is that these were modern revolutions to establish the modern society, particularly the society of property owners. Today we're going to discuss the revolution that actually made an effort to go beyond this, to enfranchise not only property owners but wide circle of people. And what happened as a result of this, we will see. Just to summarize from the outset, the American Revolution, the English Revolution, and the French Revolution were revolutions that brought to power governments that claimed to defend the power of the middle class people, or as Marxists call them, the bourgeoisie. These were the governments that made at least significant part of society equal in the eyes of the law. Of course, the treatment of people was still uneven. In England, for instance, as a result of the Glorious Revolution, according to the Bill of Rights, only about 4% of the people were enfranchised. It's a bookish word to describe the situation when people received rights. So only landlords, gentry, and rich townspeople became, so to speak, citizens. Of course, there was no yet concept of citizens, but at least they received rights. They were to be tried in case they committed a crime, and by the trial of jury. They were not arbitrarily abused. They were not to lose the property without a court. The king recognized their rights. The power of the king was limited by the Bill of Rights. That was the English Revolution, 1688. And king also had to recognize the English Parliament that had the House of Lords and House of Commons. And then we go further. We have the American Revolution, which went further than the English Revolution, which gave rights to at least, again, it's a superficial number, but let's say it gave rights to at least 20% of the population that lived in English colonies, North America, except Canada, of course, New England, southern states, so only 20%. Was it good or bad? Remember, we talked about this last time. From a present viewpoint, it was bad, but if you compare what had existed at that time in the world, it was good. It was a movement, a step forward toward giving rights to more people. Even though, I repeat, 80% of people, and we listed these classes of people who had no rights yet. Still, it was a move forward. Today, we're going to discuss the French Revolution, which went further than the American Revolution. The French Revolution, in fact, gave rights to all males. They were not ready yet at that time to give rights to women, but still all males, including at some point slaves. So everybody, people who lived in France and French colonies, all males received rights. It means they could vote formally, they could testify in the court, so they could sign documents, so they were full-fledged citizens. And that's how I asked you to view these revolutions. Remember that we cannot judge them from our present viewpoint. It's not a good way to approach history. We have to judge these revolutions, the regimes that these revolutions brought to life, by the standards of that time, by the contemporary standards. Okay. So where should we start our story about the French Revolution? Strange as it may sound, our story begins in America. Yes, in America. Remember last time when I told you that the French people came to help the Americans against the British in the fight against the King of England. So they provided the mass help to the Americans. They were responsible, French, for building up the American army, the American Navy. So they provided the diplomatic support to the Americans. Okay, it was substantial help. I'm sure if it hadn't been for the French, the American Revolution probably would have won anyway, but it could have happened later, much later. So French help was essential for the victory of the American Revolution. We should keep it in mind, okay? How did the American Revolution affect France? First, of course, what was on the surface. When Americans created a republic of property owners, it infested France and Europe in general with these ideas of revolution. So, American Revolution that was influenced by French Enlightenment itself influenced France after so-called founding fathers took over power. So it set an example that you could establish a republic. Remember, England did not have a republic. English people, the parliament still wanted a king, although with a limited power. But the Americans decided to opt out of this kingship. They hated the king so much, they said, we are not going to have any kings. So they established a republic, and this Republican experience became very, very captivating for those Enlightenment writers, intellectuals, activists who lived in France, okay? But that's not the whole story. The major part of the story is economics. Remember, it's about economy. It's about economy, stupid, right? Remember this expression. So everything, not everything, but a good part of our life is driven by economic considerations, money. And that's where our story begins. Financial assistance of France to the Americans was so magnificent. They spent so much money that it drained the French treasury. Of course, we have to say that the French court, the French king at that time, there was a king, his name was Louis XVI. He was in power, and he loved, like many kings, luxurious lifestyle. So he was a spender. So he spent a lot of money. But on top of this, the assistance provided to the American Revolution was so huge that it drained the French treasury. So there was no money left. There was a problem. How to raise the money? Where to get money in order for the French state to exist? To pay salaries to government people. Army, of course, officer corps. And that's where our story begins. The year is 1789. At that time, in France, there were three major groups of people, or three major classes. They were called estates. The first estate was clergy. It means church people. Abbots, people who were in charge of monasteries. Bishops, people who were in charge of church districts. Or priests who were in charge of particular parishes, so clergy. So they didn't pay any taxes because they were church people. And by the way, you know, and many church people don't pay taxes to the present day. For instance, in the United States, churches don't pay taxes, as you know. The second estate, they didn't pay any taxes, was noble or gentry or aristocrats. You can use them. I'm using synonyms here. So these big landlords, noble people who belong to this hereditary aristocracy, because they were their forefathers were knights who lived in castles. Again, I'm simplifying the whole story, but anyway, you got the point. So landed aristocracy that had a lot of lands, and they didn't pay any taxes because they were nobles, they were lords. Okay, and also they owned a lot of land. Okay, both the church people, clergy, and nobles owned a lot of land. For example, 1/3 of all agricultural lands belong to the church, monasteries, clergy. Another third belong to nobles, and the rest, what, belong to middle class people, peasants, the government. Okay, so clergy and nobles were the major landholders, landholders. But the third estate, or third group, it was everybody else. So who could be named here who belonged to this state? It was a motley crowd, third estate. There were people of different backgrounds here, primarily peasants. 80% of third estate were peasants who worked on the land, and some of them were still partially serfs, not all of them. Parts of France got rid of serfdom. Remember who serfs were? People who were not allowed to leave their land estates, who were obligated to work for landlords. So in much of France, peasants were already free people. Of course, they depended on lords, so they owed money to lords or church. They had to work for this, but many peasants were not serfs. But still, there were a lot of serfs. For example, church had 1.3 million serfs. Again, church was the major serfs holder in bondage. So a lot of peasants were in bondage, so they hated the church. So you have to understand this. So 1.3 million French peasants were serfs who worked for monasteries or particular parishes, mostly monasteries. And some nobles still had serfs. So what do we have here? We have a group of people who are minority, by the way. Tiny, tiny minority. How many of them? Again, if you look at this slide, you will see that only 3% of the population had land and didn't pay any taxes. It's a very significant part of the people. I'm sorry, it was a very significant part of the land domain, and only a minority of people. So the third estate was peasants. There were also some people who were merchants, who were bankers, who were teachers, lawyers, or any kind of people. But still, they were not nobles, not clergy, so they had to pay taxes. To make a long story short, two groups of people, clergy and nobles, did not pay any taxes. The third group of people, third estate, paid all the taxes. So after the French treasury was empty, there was a question, who is going to pay taxes? So the king who was in power at that time, he was actually a very weak king. He did not produce this authority. Okay, in fact, he was more concerned about hunting. He liked to go to watch how watchmakers work, how artisans work. He liked to dine and wine. Okay. He didn't like to get involved in the life of the government. So there are some people who love to run things and some people who don't like it. Okay. So he was more concerned about a good time, good food, okay, socializing with people, didn't care about state affairs, okay. And it was bad at this time, of course. The role of personality is very important, okay. So what he did, he decided to bring together. He realized, and he told these two groups of people, clergy and nobles, you guys don't pay any taxes. So it's not correct. So he did sincerely wanted to do something for the third estate, although he represented, by his class origin, so to speak, he represented nobles. So he was part of this class, okay. So what we have here the king who wanted to act as a middleman. Sincerely wanted to do something for the third estate. And actually, later he fell a victim of this sincere attempt because he wanted actually to sit on two chairs. Okay. That was his big mistake, to sit on two chairs. He brings together these three groups of people, and he said, you need to negotiate somehow. You need to negotiate to decide who is going to pay taxes. And that's where the quarrel begins. So a quarrel which eventually produced the French Revolution. Okay, the French Revolution. The third estate said, first we need to decide how we're going to be represented. The first two estates, nobles and clergy, said, let's make it simple. So let's make sure that since we have three groups, let's just say 100 people from clergy, 100 people from nobles, and 100 people from third estate. But third estate said, come on, we cannot do it because we are the majority. So you're only 3% of the population. We are 97% of the population. How come? So they leave this meeting and they meet separately. Third estate. People who came to represent the third estate, they said, we are going to have our own meeting. We are going to have our own parliament. And we need to go by a simple rule. One man, one vote. So that's fair. But in this case, the first two estates, they were scared of this. They said, no, we cannot do it because these guys from the third estate, they will always outvote us. So we cannot accept this. So that is why the third estate meets and so-called tennis court. They met at the tennis court and took an oath, the third estate representatives. And they said, we're going to do elections for a new parliament. And we're going to call it National Assembly. And that's how revolution begins. Okay, revolution begins from this decision. The king who acted as a middleman, he was pressured to accept this. The third estate pressured him, and since he was wishy-washy, and he wanted to do for clergy and nobles, at the same time he said, fairly enough, that you guys don't pay any taxes, you have to pay because third estate pays everything. So he endorsed literally this National Assembly, opened the doors to the revolution. Okay. At the same time, what happened triggered a lot of discontent, where in the countryside, where people hated the situation that landlords had all the land. Okay. It triggered also people in the cities who hated that a church controlled everything, a royal bureaucracy controlled everything. So the mobs in big cities in the countryside started to attack Nobles started to attack church properties, monasteries were attacked. Okay, and one of the big events was so-called storming of Bastille. Storming of Bastille. Bastille, it was fortress. Look at this picture right here. Okay, so a mob of people in Paris raided this big fortress called Bastille. Bastille, it was an arsenal where guns and ammunition was stored, and powder, the kegs of powder, and also prisoners were held there in Bastille. So the big crowd stormed this fortress because they thought there were a lot of prisoners here. As it turned out, there were only 3 prisoners, but it didn't matter. It was a very symbolic event because Bastille, in the eyes of people of France, Paris and France in general, it was the symbol of the old order. So they revolted against the old order, the old feudal order, where 3 classes of people, church, nobles, and third estate, had different courts, different systems, so treated differently. The third estate wanted everybody to be treated the same. So let's apply same standards to everybody else. We shouldn't have any privileged groups like church people or nobles. If nobody pays taxes, nobody pays taxes. If everybody pays taxes, everybody pays taxes. If we have one set of courts for church people, one set of courts for nobles, and one set of courts for the third estate, it's not fair because these are 3 different systems of courts. So we need to have the same court system. Okay, it's fair. Yes, it's fair. So storming of Bastille, and during this time we have a French general, a very charismatic person, who comes up as one of the leaders of the revolution. His name is Marquis de Lafayette. Marquis de Lafayette, who was appointed by the people, by the crowd, to be in charge of the French National Guard. Okay, so the Paris mob played the major role here. And even though he was an aristocrat, Marquis de Lafayette, he sided with the grassroots, with the third estate. Okay. And in fact, the reason I mention him is to also stress that Marquis de Lafayette, he was the person who took an active part in the American Revolution. Okay, he was, as last time I told you, one of the chief lieutenant of George Washington, who was in charge of building up the American army during the Revolution. So when he came back to France, he brought these ideas of republic, you know, even though personally he was an aristocrat. So he brought the ideas of republic, okay, the ideas of this anti-feudalism, and that is why he was appointed to be one of the leaders of this revolution. Okay, the revolution, again, I will explain to you why I mentioned this name, because it's important for us. If you look at my slide, and you will see this something I colored in red color. It's the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, 1789. It's the major document of the French Revolution. Like for the American Revolution, it was the Declaration of Independence. Here, in case of France, we have the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, 1789, which granted freedoms to the French people and declared certain principles on which the new French nation would be established, would be ruled, the type of government France was going to have. Marquis de Lafayette, by the way, was one of the people who wrote this Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. And in fact, Thomas Jefferson also helped to write the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. So that's how we have this cross-fertilized relationships between France and the United States, where people were helping each other, feeding these ideas of enlightenment about natural rights to each other. So Marquis de Lafayette, a hero of two nations, that was the nickname he received at that time, the hero of two nations, United States and France, plus Thomas Jefferson, they were among the major people who to write this Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Okay. Of course, in case of France, we don't have the situation that they didn't need to secede from anybody else, because France was the country that there was no issue of secession here. So what was the issue? The issue was to get rid of so-called ancient ancien regime. That's an ancient regime, the old feudal regime. The declaration, French declaration, said that power should be shared between the king and the parliament. And of course, the court system should be created. Like in England, or like in the United States. The only thing, see, at first in France, they didn't go for this American Republican ideas. They were not ready yet at this point to kind of, to destroy the kingship completely. So the power should be shared between the king and parliament, general estates, and courts. Okay. The source of all power was the nation, French nation. That's what the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen declared. Okay. Not the king, but the nation. It's very important. See, the English Declaration did not say this, that the English nation was the source of power. But here we have an interesting, a far-going limitation on the power of the king. And plus, I repeat, the king was a weakling. He was a very, very humble, by the way, at that time, he said he was not manly person. Okay. And it was true, because it was his wife, Marie Antoinette, who was more charismatic, more energetic person. Okay. But she didn't have enough experience in governmental life. So in this case, it didn't do any good to France. Although, I repeat, she was more energetic, more interested in life of the government, unlike her husband, who didn't care about, or hardly cared about anything. It was just drudgery for him. He liked to have fun, using the modern day expression, instead of doing governmental work. Okay, so the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen destroyed all the privileges of nobles and church. Okay, all privileges were abolished. So we're the same in the eyes of the law. All men are citizens right now. All of them are equal. Okay. And all males were declared citizens. That's very important. All males became citizens. Including slaves, because France had colonies. Remember, sugar plantations, Caribbean islands. Okay. So, formally, all males became citizens. They could write, they could exercise right to vote, they could be elected, they could testify in courts. Of course, women were excluded. I repeat, even in case of France, which decided to go further than Americans, to give rights not only people of property, but to all males, they were not ready yet to go as far as giving rights to all women. Okay, that's how society was at that time. Okay. Again, you have to remember that no males had rights at that time, like in the Middle East or in Russia and India and China. Okay, so you have to compare what was going on in France, US with other civilizations. Anyway, no rights for women at that point. Okay, but still, I want to mention that there were groups of women in France who actually tried to push for this, but they were minorities. That is why they were not listened to at that time. There were groups of women who actually composed an like a follow-up to what was done in 1789. A group of women wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and Citizen. Woman and Citizen. Same year. And they tried to storm into this National Assembly to kind of force the crowd to at least consider it. And of course, nobody supported this. No person from the parliaments, French parliament, Estates General supported it. And unfortunately, majority of women at that time didn't care about this. So it was a tiny group of people. So I guess society was not ready yet at that time for this. Okay, I have to mention this. So what happened in France shocked all royalty of Europe. Okay, at first they didn't care too much about this. Okay, but then when noticed that the situation was getting out of control and revolution was getting more and more radical, okay, especially what people were concerned about, that nobles' estates were confiscated by people. Peasants raided land estates, set on fire mansions of landlords, and divided lands of landlords among themselves. Big crowds of city mobs attacked stores, properties, seized them, okay? And that's what upset. The king was literally hostage within this revolution, okay? Formally, he endorsed the revolution. He said, I'm with you, by the way, don't touch me. And in fact, he even took an oath of citizen. So he said, I'm a citizen too, okay? He was also forced to sign a document which was called the Civic Oath of Clergy. So all church people, France was predominantly Catholic country, so all church people were forced to sign a special oath. They pledged allegiance to the French nation, because revolutionaries, people who spearheaded the French Revolution, they were afraid that church people would be still loyal to the Roman Pope. Remember, for Catholics, the major loyalty to the Roman Pope. And they said, you guys need to be loyal to the nation. So they forced them to take an oath of allegiance to the French nation. And only 10,000 church people agreed, so majority disagreed. So some of them were executed for this, some of them were beaten, some of them had to escape from France. So very bad. But the king signed this. So he was so intimidated, the king. So he had to sign this, to endorse this. But deep inside, he was in fear. He realized the situation was getting out of control. So to make a long story short, he decided to escape from France. And unfortunately, this plot of escape was exposed. He was caught on the border, apprehended, and brought back to Paris. And that's when the majority of the French people became so upset about the king, so they treated him as a traitor who wanted to betray them to the kings and queens of Europe. At that time, by 1792, 1791, 1792, revolution was going militant. French Revolution was going militant. It wanted to go further, okay? It wanted to legalize the confiscation of lands, of nobles and church, okay? And also it wanted to expand the revolution beyond France, to bring it to other countries. At the same time, kings and queens of Europe hated the French Revolution, and they wanted also to organize a campaign against the French revolutionaries, okay? After king was caught, he was brought to trial, and revolutionaries were so mad at him, they put him not only to trial, but they condemned him as a traitor to be executed. So, and he was executed. The French king was executed. Although he was, as I said, from a governmental viewpoint, was weakling, didn't have God, didn't care about the government, but going to the place of his execution, he was surprisingly calm and didn't express any emotions, which is amazing how different people behave in different situations. So he was executed, which shocked. It was second time when people executed their own king. The first time, remember, it was in England, right? Before Glorious Revolution, 1642, the English people executed their own king. Now it's a second time, another revolution. French people executed their own king, which shocked all kings and queens of Europe. So they decided to get together against the French Revolution. And that's what also radicalized the French Revolution. In fact, historically, we can divide the French Revolution in two big periods. The period before 1792, it was the period of constitutional monarchy, when the power of the king was not yet eliminated, and formally France was a constitutional monarchy. Okay, in the second period, since 1792 to 1795, it's so-called militant period, when a new group of people, more militant, more radical, took over and decided to radicalize the revolution. The name of these people was Jacobins. Jacobins, it was a group of radical French revolutionaries, mostly city people, teachers, lawyers, writers, this type of people, journalists. Okay, Jacobins. Why Jacobins? Because their favorite place together was a Dominican a club that belonged to the Dominican order. Dominican order was a Catholic order. Okay, you know, Catholic Church has a lot of orders. So one of these orders is Dominican order, and it owned a club on a street named Jacob Street. So that's how they were nicknamed by the enemies Jacobins, because they liked to meet on this Jacob Street at this club confiscated from this Catholic order. Okay, so Jacobins. Jacobins wanted to expand the revolution, so they wanted to legalize this confiscation of lands of nobles and church, and they wanted to give power to the common man. Okay, some of them even suggested that properties of merchants, third estate, so merchants belong to the third estate, properties of rich people in general should be confiscated. Again, some bankers were also people who belonged to the third estate, not aristocrats. So big money shouldn't be tolerated. That's what some of them said. Okay. On top of this, Jacobins, they were so radical. They wanted to cancel Christianity, Catholic Church. Again, it didn't come from nowhere. There was a reason for this. Remember, I told you the church, Catholic Church, was the biggest landowner in France. They had serfs who worked for them, obligated to work for them. And the Roman Pope was in charge of the Catholic Church, not the French Parliament. And there was jealousy. People wanted to seize lands of the church. So there was a lot of support for these ideas. So Jacobins eventually decided to shut down Christian church. They started to shut down churches. Okay. And instead of Christian religion, they declared a religion of reason. Not all of them, but there was a radical element of Jacobins said we need the religion of reason instead of Christian church. Since we have science, science is everything. Science is going to be our religion. Okay. In fact, one of the Jacobins, his name is Dupont, he famously said, nature's reason is my religion. Nature is, and reason is my religion. That's what my religion. I quote, that's what he said. So this arrogant statements, which I repeat, didn't come from nowhere. They were these ideas of enlightenment taken to the extreme. See, they were feeding on these ideas of enlightenment because the French Revolution was also the child of enlightenment, like the American Revolution. Okay. What we have this radicalization of the French Revolution. Jacobins decided to crack down on people who were hesitant to support revolution, people who could be potentially enemies of the revolution, people who were speaking against the revolution. So not necessarily people who were responsible for doing something against the revolution, but for people, they organized attacks on the people who were simply speaking against the revolution. What they did, they declared a terror against the enemies, real and imagined enemies of the revolution. A huge terror. To do it, to execute people. And they, in fact, invented this new device to quickly cut the heads of the people called guillotine. Again, reason I'm emphasizing this, it's an example of how scientific accomplishments, accomplishments of mechanics in this case, could be used to perfect killing of people. See, guillotine, it's a very symbolic device It symbolized that how the accomplishments of science could be used to kill against the people, to kill the people. So, and of course, next century, and especially 2 centuries late in the 20th century, we have more and more these tools of science, or products of science, that were used to kill the people. Okay, no need to name them, but again, it started with guillotine and ended with the nuclear weapons. Or nuclear weapons, they're very destructive. Okay, so enlightenment served not only purposes of enlightening people, like progressing them, perfecting the life of society, but it also could be used for destructive purposes. The Reign of Terror destroyed 40,000 people. About 40,000 people were executed by guillotine, which included those folk who supported the king, the former king who deceased. It included church people and also common people who represented the third estate, who either didn't like something or who were speaking against the revolution. Okay, and thousands more were imprisoned. Thousands more had to escape abroad. Okay, in fact, the symbol of the religion of reason was a lady, a former prostitute in Paris. She was chosen to symbolize this, the goddess of reason. And here you can see this old image of this lady. She was carried by a group of people across the streets of Paris to symbolize this goddess of reason. Okay, a sculpture was made after her. A sculpture that I think in one hand she held a book of science, I suppose, and another one compass or some scientific device to symbolize the power of science. So science is going to be our religion. Okay, during this time, the time of militant stage of the French Revolution, all power was granted by the new parliament. A new parliament was elected, the more radical parliament called National Convention, instead of the old National Assembly that was disbanded. The new parliament was elected. There were new elections, and the more radical parliament was elected, called National Convention. And this National Convention granted dictatorial powers to so-called Committee of Public Safety. Committee of Public Safety. Okay, that's what I outlined and read here. You can see it on my slide. Committee of the Public Safety to fight domestic and foreign enemies. And the person who became prominent during the second stage of the French Revolution was Maximilien Robespierre. Maximilien Robespierre, who was a French Paris lawyer, fanatic supporter of the revolution. Okay, he wanted to promote, radicalize the French Revolution, to make it more militant. He was a Jacobin. Okay, and he came to enjoy his dictatorial powers. Okay, not only he wanted to bless the French nation, he also enjoyed power for the power itself. And he was happy to execute enemies of the revolution. He was actually in charge, pretty much in charge of this terror campaign against real and imagined enemies of the revolution. And eventually, the terror which he initiated acquired life of its own. Like in a snowball effect, the terror, like a wheel, started to roll on, and soon some of the people who were his comrades, friends, were also executed because they either disagreed with him or questioned some of his actions he made. So terror is a very addictive thing. So violence is a very addictive thing. So by initiating a violence, eventually he became the prisoner of his terror. So he initiated the terror and couldn't stop this satanic, I would say, again, pardon my word, I guess, but I cannot find any other word to describe the situation when, I repeat, in a snowball effect, the terror that was started as a campaign against the enemies of revolution eventually was turned against the friends of the revolution. And that always happens, always. In all revolutions it happens, especially in militant revolutions. The terror always turns against people who initiated this terror. Okay. So the power, although power belonged to the parliament and there were elections, but the real power was granted to the Committee of Public Safety, like a dictatorial machine. Okay. Jacobins insisted on 3 points: equality, liberty, and fraternity. See, they put equality in the first place. That was important for them, more important. Reason and patriotism. So defend the country and reason. Remember, religion of reason. Robespierre and his friends were able to create the army of 800,000 people to defend the revolution, and in fact they took revolution beyond the borders of France. They confiscated all land that belonged to nobles and clergy, gave it to peasants, abolished slavery in colonies, legalized these acts. But what upset people, soon the entire country was captured in the grips of fear, because everybody was afraid that he could be treated as a potential enemy of the revolution. And that's what upset a lot of people. They could not stand this situation when the people who initiated this revolution, they in fact became the ruthless dictators, especially this guy who was in charge, Robespierre. So some of his friends lost their lives. They were executed, and the entire French parliament was in fear. The people were afraid to talk to him. So eventually a group of people in the parliament found the guts, and when on one occasion when Robespierre was delivering a speech, a group of people from the parliament jumped on him together, captured him, and tried to arrest him. Okay, he could not resist because they were so quick, because there was a fear if they would let him go, eventually they would be executed. So they quickly put him on trial and condemned him to death. So he also ended up being executed by the revolution. So the terror that was initiated by Robespierre was turned against him. So the French revolutionists who were in the parliament, they were ready to do something to improve the situation. They didn't want to have the same dictator again. So we need to save the revolution. What did they do? They decided to eliminate these Jacobins. So slowly but surely, Jacobins were driven from power. They were phased out. Robespierre and his friends were eliminated, and that's what was the end of the Jacobins. Or better to say, the beginning of the end of Jacobins. In 1 year, they were rounded up, either executed or phased out from the parliament, and a new government was formed that was represented by 5 headmen. Again, if we were to use the modern day language, we could say that France was headed by 5 presidents. They were called directors. So it was the new government of the Directory. So it was not so militant, more conservative. See, the reason they appointed 5 people, because there was a fear that another dictator like Robespierre might appear. We need to make sure that no dictator would show up. But there was another problem here, that these 5 directors, they quarreled so much with each other. So no simple decision could be taken, because they always disagreed with each other. So you could not make any economic decision, political decisions. There were a lot of squabbles among these 5 people. So in the eyes of the population, especially peasants, these directors, the entire government was losing its prestige. So people didn't trust anymore. So look what happened in France. There was an interesting situation. on the one hand, people, and again, who were the people? Peasants. 80% of the population were peasants. They didn't want the king to come back. They didn't want nobles to come back or church to get back their lands. They wanted actually to confirm the seizures of the lands, peasants. They wanted to make sure that the lands they seized during the revolution would belong to them. They wanted to have a legal title to these lands. But on the other hand, the people hated these Jacobins, these militant folk who killed indiscriminately people left and right, 40,000 executed people, not necessarily people who were aristocrats, but a lot of common people were executed as well. So we don't want these left-wing nuts. We don't want right-wing. We don't want left-wing. So what do you need to do? Who is the force that would come to establish this law and order to cancel these extreme left and extreme right? And there was the only force in France at that time that could exercise influence on the population, that maintained prestige. It was the army, the French army, the only force to be trusted. Why? Because the French army, when these squabbles, when this terror was going on within France, French army, in fact, promoted its prestige. The French army was increasing its prestige and power. How? Through its numerous victories. The French army won a lot of victories against those enemies who wanted to squash the French Revolution. Why? The French army was so powerful because French generals now asked people not to fight for their king. So they were told, the soldiers were told, that they were fighting for the French nation. Okay, so it was more powerful, more powerful. You were fighting for the French Revolution, for your rights, and for the French nation. So a lot of victories were won. And some of the French officers started of humble origin. They were able to promote themselves during these revolutionary wars against French neighbors. And that's when we need to bring this man to our attention. I'm sure everybody knows the name of this man. Okay, it's Napoleon Bonaparte, famous Napoleon Bonaparte, who came to fill this void, who came to become this people's dictator, or people's emperor, who would say, because he did set up a new dynasty, but it was a strange dynasty. It was a dynasty that was endorsed by the population, because he actually, at some point, he even staged a referendum asking French people, so do you want me to become your new king? And the majority of people in 1803 said, yes, we want you to be our new king. So as I say, some kind of a popular king, people's king. Okay, see, interesting example how with one foot French society was still standing in the old time, and another foot was in the new time. Okay, so Napoleon coming to fill this void, on the one hand, not a regular emperor, on the other hand, people's emperor. And in fact, his first title he acquired when he came to fill this void, to become the middleman who would bring law and stability to France. His title was not an emperor at first. It happened a few years later. His first title was the first consul. The first consul. Okay. So Napoleon in 1799 was asked by French people who were in National Convention, people who were in charge of the revolution, to come and to exercise his power. Okay, because directory, the stress on the last syllabus, lost so much of its power and prestige that there was no political power to fill the void. So only the military man, Napoleon. Why Napoleon? 1799, he comes, he was asked, to come to bring the law and order. That's what people of France had cravings for, to have law and order. Okay, so Napoleon comes, and with the agreement, with the consent of the National Assembly, with the consent of the French Revolutionaries Directory, he got this title, the First Consul. Okay, formally he eliminates the Constitution. He imposes restrictions on political parties, so he didn't allow political parties, both on the left and on the right. Okay. At the same time, he gave peasants titles to their lands, so whatever you seized from landlords, it's yours. He also adopted so-called Civil Code of 1804. It's a uniform civil and criminal code, which means that all people who were in France were to be treated equal in the eyes of the law. So we don't have any nobles, church people, or third estate. All of us are equal. He also introduced the new national currency. At the same time, he tried to placate the Roman Pope by saying, I'm not going to fight Catholic Church anymore. So Catholics are good, they're allowed, and he brought back Catholic Church, brought back to France. And a lot of clergy who escaped from France came back home. He even said those royal people who don't have any grudge against me, they can come back too. You know, people who originally supported the king, you can come too. So, but I'm not going to allow you to form political parties. Okay. So he suppressed opposition on the left and on the right, since he was to be the one to bring law and order. But again, the question was, why Napoleon? What was so special about him? First, he symbolized the French Revolution. So he was a person, even though his father was an aristocrat, but his father died when he was young. And basically, he grew up in a very impoverished environment. So his mother was a very poor woman. She struggled to give him education. Eventually, he went to a military school. So basically, from rags to high positions. So he started from a humble position of a lieutenant, and was able during the Revolutionary War to promote himself because of his skills, because of his merit. Military skills. He was able to promote himself up to a general. So he became a revolutionary general because he had this military genius. Okay, military genius. So in the eyes of the common people, he symbolized this common man who was able to bring himself up. He made himself up, and it's true, that's what he did. And that is why the Civil Code of 1804 declared that people should be promoted on the basis of merit, on their skills, not on the basis of their origin, class, whatever. But on the bad side, he reinstalled slavery in colonies because the sugar plantation owners petitioned him. They were struggling so much, bring back slavery because we're losing our incomes. So he had to bring it back. On the other hand, he gave rights to Jews in Europe. In each European city which he invaded, he destroyed the walls of Jewish ghettos. If you don't know that, you need to know that at that time, 1600s, before 1600s, in Europe, Jews were confined to special ghettos. They were called ghetto. The word ghetto comes from Netherlands, Amsterdam, the area that was populated by Jews. So they had to be confined to ghettos. And in many European cities, they were not allowed to travel outside of the walls of ghettos. So Napoleon destroyed these walls of ghettos, and it was good. So he was a very complicated person. So on the one hand, he was a conservative force. On the other hand, he was we would say, progressive force. Okay. His major tool was nationalism. So he appealed to the sense, to the feeling of French nationalism, the French nation. So our major loyalty now is not to the king, because we don't have a king. We are a republic. French became a republic after they executed the king. France was declared a republic. So since we don't have a king, we are a republic. Our major loyalty is to the nation. And in fact, he was a general. So after he came to power, he wanted to continue the fight against the enemies of the revolution, these kings and queens of Europe who had attacked France. So he didn't like them. He wanted to invade them. Why? Because he was a general. War was the major thing. He knew better than anything else. Okay, and plus, war was the best way to glue French people together. And he said, we have the revolution. It's the best. It gave rights to the people, and we're French nation. So we have to fight for France. Let's invade other nations and bring them freedom. And also we will bring glory to the French nation. And that's how he embarked on the military campaigns all over Europe. Okay, and unfortunately, eventually, these military campaigns became the source of his undoing. Okay. Napoleon crowned himself as the Emperor of France, 1804, but not arbitrarily, with the consent of the French people. Okay, the French people, in fact, had to go to a referendum where they were asked a question: would you like him to be the emperor or not? And majority of people accepted him as the new emperor. Okay. So he goes to other European countries and he attacked Germanic kingdoms. Germany was divided in numerous kingdoms, so he seized these kingdoms. He invades Poland, attacks Poland. Part of Poland was occupied by Prussia, a Germanic state, another part by Russia. So he seizes Poland. He also invades northern Italy, he invades Spain. So eventually the whole Europe was occupied by Napoleon. And he was an excellent general. Hardly anybody could defeat him. He was a very skillful general, I repeat. A good strategy, knew how to fight. Eventually he invades Russia, the huge empire. Like, remember, I told you when we discussed last time the American Revolution, how one English general had problems fighting George Washington because he said North America was so huge, the forest and mountains were, the spaces of North America was so vast. And in frustration, by chasing Washington troops, he said, you cannot conquer the map. The same words we can apply to this situation. When Napoleon invaded Russia, this huge empire, the biggest country in the world, that stretched from Finland in the west to Alaska and California in the east, if you go to the east from Europe. Okay, the biggest empire in the whole world. So Napoleon wanted to conquer this empire. It was a very arrogant idea. So he invades Russia in 1812, and he was not defeated. He was moving, hardly facing any resistance. But eventually he reaches Moscow, and Russian army, in fact, left Moscow. He occupied Moscow, but there he found no food, no fuel, and he was very much frustrated because he stretched out his supply lines and he realized that his big army, which had 600,000 people, was starving. Soldiers were sick, and the Russian wind literally destroyed his troops. On this picture, by the way, you can see this, I would say, physical destruction of the French army, not by the Russian army, but the Mother Nature. So here you can see this ragtag army of Napoleon trying to escape from back to Europe, escaping from Russia, hungry, angry, and he could not control them. Okay, they had no food, they had nothing. Some of them were killed by neighboring peasants, robbers, or people were fighting each other. Okay, fighting for food, killing their horses for food. So basically his army turned into a gang of people who could not be controlled, who tried to escape home from this inhospitable Russia where they couldn't find any food, and where population avoided them, were afraid of them. And Napoleon literally left his army and came back to France, and that's how he was defeated. Okay. Another defeat he experienced in Western Hemisphere, where in Santo Domingo Island, it's a present-day Haiti. Remember, one of the first places in the New World discovered by Christopher Columbus. So here in Haiti, there was a slave revolt. Originally, French Revolution granted freedoms, freed the slaves, but Napoleon brought it back. So there was slave revolt against slavery, and Napoleon decided to squash this revolt. He sent about 30,000 troops to this island, okay, to reinstall slavery, to subdue the resistance of slaves. But before they even started doing any fighting against this runaway slaves or rebellious slaves, the French army started to perish, not from axes, bullets, and spears of the runaway slaves, but from the fever, yellow fever. Remember, tropical disease for which these people had no immunity. No immunity. So here, by the way, you can see a picture of how a group of so-called Maroons, it was a nickname for runaway slaves who, armed with muskets, pikes, spears, swords, axes, ambushed, attacked the French soldiers. And here you can see one of these attacks against invading French army on the island of Haiti. So harassed by these ambushes and sick with yellow fever, the French army soon became dysfunctional. So the soldiers couldn't fight, and Napoleon was so angry, and he decided to bring this army, and that's how the slave revolution won in Haiti. Okay, the first slave revolution that became successful. 1803, the slaves of Haiti won this revolution, got freedom for themselves, and the person who was in charge of this revolution was he was a free man, actually. That is why he had the chance to learn how to read and to write. Okay, he was employed in a management position. His name was Toussaint Louverture. Toussaint Louverture. So it's hard to spell, hard to say, hard to spell. So this person was in charge of this. Revolution, and eventually he was tricked by the French government within France, and they put him in prison where he died. Okay, but I would like you to remember this name because he was in charge of this revolution. So Napoleon was, first of all, general. Okay, again, general who was successful, but at the same time he was defeated, not militarily in Russia or in Haiti, but the mother nature. Both in Russia and Haiti, he was defeated by nature. In Russia by Russian winter and the huge spaces of Russia. In Haiti by yellow fever and this disease wiped out his army. So Napoleon, I repeat, was a complex person. There were arguments in favor of Napoleon, as he was able administrator, promoted people on the basis of talent, merit, able, efficient, popular. Okay, he kept promises to peasants, did a lot for French peasants who loved him. He introduced the new legal code that made all males equal in the eyes of the law. Okay, he promoted administrative reforms, set up rational government, destroyed privileges of nobles. Okay, eliminated formal discrimination of Jews. But on the other hand, see, he reintroduced slavery in colonies. He exercised censorship of press, didn't allow political parties. Okay. And one of his weaknesses, which undermined his in these new lands, newly conquered lands, was that he did not allow in the lands which he had conquered self-government of the people. On the one hand, he said, oh, we are the French Revolution. We are bringing people, we are bringing freedoms to all serfs. And in fact, in many areas he conquered in Europe, Central Eastern Europe, he declared serfdom illegal. So he liberated the serfs, which was good. Peasant serfs became free. But at the same time, he did not allow conquered people to create their own self-government, to create their own parliaments, to be in charge of their own affairs. Instead, he placed in charge of these newly conquered lands his relatives, nephews, brothers, which upset local people, and that's what, again, was his undoing, because he unleashed his hopes. Because in some, to be fair, in some areas of Europe, people were waiting for him. They thought he would liberate them. He would give them freedom. He would allow them to create parliaments. Okay, but he didn't do it. He did conquer the lands, but at the same time, he put in charge of these conquered lands, Italy, Central Europe, and Germanic kingdoms, his relatives or Frenchmen. Okay. So that was the end of our story about the French Revolution. Eventually, the results of the French Revolution, which ended with Napoleon, was to roll back a bit what Jacobins did, this helter-skelter policies of Jacobins, to bring back conservatism, but at the same time, without reinstalling old feudal society. So basically, he was a middleman who tried to compromise. So what happened in France, a new government was created, the government of property owners. Okay, that was very important. The government of the middle class people. That's what we have in France as a result of Napoleon's activities. Okay. Even after he was toppled down in 1814, because he eventually was defeated, I repeat, not militarily, but physically, by geography, by circumstances. 1814, he was defeated. Eventually, he was exiled to St. Helens Island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. But what he had created was not rolled down. Even though France became headed by a king was brought back. Okay. A new king. But still, the legal code he created, new rules, the equality in the eyes of the law, it was not eliminated. It was there, and it was his greatest accomplishment. Okay, half of the population in France at least became citizens who could claim rights, and they tried to exercise their rights. And that is going to be the end of our story for today, and I will see you next time. Thank you for your